Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There are moments in time that feel like punctuation marks in the story of our lives. A comma where we pause. A period where something ends. But some moments are ellipses, trailing off into nothing, leaving us waiting for words that never come. This is a story about those ellipses. About the silence that follows violence. About the years that stretch between a question asked and an answer given, if it ever comes at all. Time is supposed to heal. That's what people say when they don't know what else to offer. Give it time. Time heals all wounds. But time doesn't heal anything on its own. Time just passes, indifferent and relentless, while we carry our wounds forward into each new day. And sometimes, time becomes the enemy of truth. Memories fade like photographs left in the sun. Evidence degrades. Witnesses move away or pass on. The world forgets, because the world must keep turning, and there are always new tragedies demanding attention. But here's what most people don't understand about time and truth. Some things don't fade. Some evidence waits, patient and silent, in boxes stacked in evidence rooms or tucked away in closets by families who can't bring themselves to throw anything away. Some memories don't blur with age but sharpen, becoming more vivid, more painful, more insistent. And some questions, once asked, echo forward through decades, growing louder in the silence rather than quieter. This is a story about 5 lives that ended too soon. 5 investigations that stretched across years, some across decades. 5 families who learned to live with absence the way other people live with chronic pain, always there, always aching, sometimes manageable and sometimes not. These are not stories about heroes and villains, though there are certainly people who did terrible things. These are stories about time itself, about what survives and what doesn't, about the stubborn persistence of truth even when justice seems impossible. The first thing you need to understand is that most crimes are not solved in an hour, the way they are on television. There is no brilliant detective who sees what everyone else missed, no sudden revelation that makes everything clear. Most investigations are slow, tedious work, interviews that lead nowhere, evidence that raises more questions than it answers, leads that seem promising until they dissolve into nothing. And sometimes, often, cases go cold not because investigators don't care, but because they've exhausted every avenue they know to pursue. The second thing you need to understand is that cold cases don't stay frozen. They sit in filing cabinets and evidence lockers, yes, but they also sit in the minds of detectives who couldn't let go, in the hearts of families who never stopped hoping, in the collective memory of communities that whisper about what happened. And occasionally, years or even decades later, something shifts. A new technology emerges. A witness finally speaks. A piece of evidence that meant nothing at the time suddenly becomes crucial. The third thing, and perhaps the most important, is that even when cases are solved, even when arrests are made and convictions secured, the resolution is never clean. The dead don't come back. The years of wondering don't unhappen. Families don't get the version of their loved one back who existed before tragedy struck. Justice, when it comes, is partial at best. It's a closing of a chapter that should never have been opened, an answer to a question that should never have been asked. In the American West, distance can be a kind of violence all on its own. Between cities, there are vast stretches of scrubland and desert, mountains and forest, places where a person can vanish as completely as if they'd never existed. The landscape swallows secrets. Roads stretch for miles without another car in sight. Cell phone towers are sparse. In places like this, isolation isn't romantic or peaceful. It's dangerous. Arroyo Bend, Nevada, was that kind of place. Not quite a town, more of a collection of buildings loosely organized around a single main road. Population maybe 800 on a good day, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The nearest city of any size was 45 minutes away. The landscape was beautiful in its harshness, all red rock and sage, dramatic sunsets that painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. But beautiful things can also be deadly. In the early 1990s, Arroyo Bend was even more isolated than it is now. No internet yet, no cell phones. The local sheriff's department consisted of 3 deputies and a sheriff who'd held the position for 20 years. Crime was mostly minor, disputes between neighbors, occasional theft, drunk driving. The kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Elena Ruiz was 26 years old in the spring of 1993. She worked as a waitress at the diner on Main Street, the only real restaurant in town. People who knew her described her as friendly without being intrusive, the kind of person who remembered your usual order and asked about your kids. She lived alone in a small apartment above the hardware store, had lived there for 3 years since moving to Arroyo Bend from California. She told people she wanted a quieter life, something simpler than the chaos of the city. On a Tuesday in March, Elena had the morning shift at the diner. She arrived at 6 a.m., just like always, helped with the breakfast rush, served coffee and eggs and pancakes to the regulars who came in before heading to work. At 2 in the afternoon, her shift ended. She was seen leaving the diner, waving goodbye to the cook, getting into her car, a blue Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door. That was the last confirmed sighting of Elena Ruiz alive. At first, no one was concerned. Elena was an adult. She didn't have family in town. When she didn't show up for her shift the next morning, the diner owner called her apartment. No answer. He figured maybe she was sick or had driven to the city for something. It wasn't until she missed a second shift that anyone started to worry. The diner owner asked one of the regular customers, a woman named Patricia who lived in the same building, to check on Elena. Patricia knocked on Elena's door. No answer. She tried the handle. Locked. She went back to her own apartment and got her spare key, the one Elena had given her months ago in case of emergencies. Inside Elena's apartment, everything looked normal. The bed was made. Dishes were washed and put away. Nothing seemed disturbed. But Elena wasn't there. Patricia called the sheriff's department. Deputy Martinez arrived within 20 minutes. He looked through the apartment, asked Patricia questions about when she'd last seen Elena, whether Elena had mentioned any plans to go somewhere. Patricia couldn't remember anything unusual. The deputy took notes, said he'd look into it, told Patricia to call if Elena showed up. By the third day, Elena's car was found. A local rancher spotted it parked off a dirt road about 8 miles outside of town, in an area used mostly by hunters and people looking to camp away from civilization. The car was locked. Inside, her purse sat on the passenger seat. Her wallet was still inside, cash and credit cards untouched. There was a grocery receipt dated to the afternoon she'd disappeared, items she'd apparently bought after leaving work. Milk, bread, eggs. The groceries were nowhere to be found. The sheriff's department organized a search. Volunteers from town spread out across the scrubland, walking in careful lines, looking for any sign of Elena. It was Deputy Martinez who found her, for days after she'd disappeared, lying in a shallow depression about half a mile from where her car had been parked. She was partially covered with brush, not buried but concealed. The scene was carefully processed. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. But even at the beginning, it was clear this was going to be difficult. There were no witnesses. No one had seen Elena after she left the diner. The grocery store clerk who'd sold her the milk and bread and eggs remembered her coming in, said she'd seemed normal, hadn't appeared upset or frightened. After that, nothing. The dirt road where her car was found didn't have much traffic. It was possible she'd been followed from town, or possible she'd gone there willingly, meeting someone. There was no way to know. The investigation proceeded the way investigations do. Interviews with everyone who'd known Elena. Had she been dating anyone? Did she have any enemies? Had anyone been bothering her? The answers were frustratingly vague. Elena had been friendly but private. She'd gone out for drinks with co-workers occasionally, but hadn't been close to anyone. No boyfriend, no obvious conflicts with anyone. She'd been, in the words of multiple people, quiet. Physical evidence was limited. There were no defensive wounds suggesting she'd fought back. Cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Time of death was estimated to be within hours of when she'd last been seen leaving the diner. Beyond that, the medical examiner couldn't offer much. The heat and exposure had degraded the scene. Investigators collected everything they could, fibers and soil samples, but in 1993, forensic technology was limited compared to what would come later. The investigation stretched on for months. The sheriff's department brought in help from the state police. They followed every lead, tracked down everyone Elena had known in California, looked into her past for anything that might explain what had happened. They found nothing that helped. Elena Ruiz had been, by all accounts, an ordinary person living an ordinary life who had encountered something terrible on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. As the months became a year, the active investigation slowed. There were other cases, other needs for limited resources. The file on Elena Ruiz moved from an active case to a cold case, stored in a box in the evidence room. The sheriff who'd overseen the investigation retired. Deputy Martinez, who'd found Elena's body, eventually left law enforcement entirely, burned out by a job that demanded more than it gave back. The diner where Elena had worked closed down, replaced years later by a gas station with a small convenience store. People moved away, or stayed and grew older, and the story of Elena Ruiz became something people mentioned occasionally when talking about the town's history, one of those tragic things that happened once, a long time ago. But Elena's family never forgot. Her mother, Rosario, who lived in California, called the sheriff's department every few months for years, asking if there had been any developments. Her younger sister, Carmen, kept a folder of newspaper clippings and copies of police reports, everything she could gather about the case. They held a memorial service on the anniversary of Elena's death every year for the first decade, then every few years after that. They never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, there would be answers. Time continued its indifferent march. The 1990s became the 2000s. Technology changed. DNA analysis improved. Databases expanded. What had once been impossible became routine. Cold case units formed in law enforcement agencies across the country, dedicated specifically to revisiting old investigations with new tools. In 2019, 26 years after Elena Ruiz was killed, a detective named Sarah Chun pulled her case file as part of a systematic review of unsolved homicides in the state. Sarah Chun was thorough. She read through every page of the investigation file, studied the evidence logs, looked at the photographs taken at the scene. She noted what had been collected, what had been tested with the technology available at the time, what had been stored but never fully analyzed. Among the items was a small collection of fibers found on Elena's clothing, along with trace evidence that had seemed insignificant in 1993. Sarah made a list of what could be retested with modern methods. The DNA analysis came back with a profile. Male. No match in the criminal database. That wasn't unusual. Many violent offenders had never been arrested for anything that would require DNA submission. But Sarah Chun didn't stop there. She'd heard about the emerging field of forensic genealogy, the use of public DNA databases, and family tree construction to identify suspects. It was a long shot, expensive and time-consuming, but the department had grant funding for cold cases. Sarah submitted the DNA profile to a specialized lab that worked with genealogical databases. Months passed. Sarah continued working other cases, but she thought about Elena Ruiz often. She'd printed one of the photographs from the case file and kept it on her desk, a reminder that this had been a real person with a real life, not just a file number. In the photo, Elena was smiling, standing outside the diner in her work uniform. She looked young and happy. Sarah wanted to give her family answers, even if those answers came decades too late. The genealogical analysis came back with a match, not to the suspect directly, but to a distant cousin. From there, the genealogists built out a family tree, identifying potential suspects who would have been the right age and in the right location in 1993. The list of names was short. One name in particular stood out: Marcus Hale. Marcus Hale had lived in Arroyo Bend in the early 1990s. He'd worked construction, moving from job to job across the region. In 1995, 2 years after Elena's death, he'd been arrested for assault in Arizona. In 2003, he'd been convicted of a violent attack on a woman in Utah, served 10 years, and been released. He currently lived in Colorado, working at a warehouse. His DNA was not in the criminal database because his Utah conviction had occurred before mandatory DNA collection became standard for all felons in that state. Sarah Chun contacted Colorado law enforcement. With their cooperation, she obtained a discarded item from Marcus Hale's trash, a soda can. The DNA from the can was tested against the profile from Elena's case. It was a match. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anger. This man had been living his life for nearly 3 decades while Elena's family wondered and grieved. He'd committed other violent crimes, hurt other women. If he'd been caught in 1993, how many people might have been spared? The arrest happened on a cold morning in October 2019. Marcus Hale was taken into custody without incident. He was transported back to Nevada to face murder charges. The news made national headlines because of the genealogical connection, this new tool for solving old crimes. But for Elena's family, the headlines were secondary to the overwhelming emotion of finally knowing. Rosario Ruiz was 81 years old when she got the call from Detective Chen. Her first reaction was disbelief. After so many years, she'd begun to think they would never know what had happened to her daughter. Carmen, Elena's sister, was at her mother's house when the call came. She held Rosario's hand while Sarah Chen explained about the DNA, the genealogical analysis, the arrest. Carmen cried. Rosario didn't, not right away. She just kept asking if they were sure, absolutely sure, that this was the person responsible. The legal proceedings moved slowly, as they always do. Marcus Hale's defense attorney fought the genealogical evidence, arguing it was obtained improperly, that the science was unreliable. Judge after judge ruled against these arguments. The evidence was solid. In June 2021, Marcus Hale pleaded guilty to second-degree murder as part of a plea agreement. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He would be 90 years old before he was eligible for parole. At the sentencing hearing, Carmen Ruiz read a victim impact statement. She talked about her sister, about the person Elena had been. She talked about the decades of not knowing, the endless wondering, the way grief had shaped her entire family's life. She talked about her mother, who had waited so long for this day and who should never have had to wait at all. When Carmen finished, she looked directly at Marcus Hale and said, "You took my sister. You took our chance to say goodbye. You took 26 years of our lives wondering. I hope you understand what you've done, though I doubt you ever will." Marcus Hale showed no emotion. He looked down at the table in front of him, his hands folded, his face blank. The judge pronounced the sentence. Bailiffs led him away. That was it. 28 years after Elena Ruiz was killed, there was finally an answer to who and why, though the why was never fully explained. Marcus Hale never gave a detailed statement about what happened that day, never expressed remorse or offered the family any real closure beyond the bare facts of his guilt. Rosario Ruiz died 3 months after the sentencing. She was 82. Carmen said later that her mother had been holding on, waiting for the case to be resolved, and once it was, she could finally let go. At Rosario's funeral, there was a photograph of Elena next to the casket, the same one from the diner, Elena smiling in her work uniform. Carmen looked at it and thought about how young her sister had been, how much life she'd been denied, and how strange it was that justice, when it finally came, felt less like relief and more like exhaustion. Detective Sarah Chun attended the funeral. She stood in the back, not wanting to intrude but wanting to pay her respects. After the service, Carmen came over to thank her. They hugged, two women connected by tragedy and determination. Sarah told Carmen that Elena had been on her mind every day since she'd pulled the case file. Carmen told Sarah that she would never forget what she'd done, giving their family the answer they'd needed for so long. But even with the case solved, even with Marcus Hale in prison, there was no undoing what had been done. Elena was still gone. The decades of grief didn't disappear. The resolution was important, necessary even, but it wasn't healing. It was simply the end of one kind of suffering and the beginning of a different kind. The knowledge that the person responsible would face consequences, but that those consequences were so inadequate compared to the loss. This is the reality of cold cases that get solved. The answers matter. Families deserve to know. Justice deserves to be served. But time doesn't reverse. The years of wondering don't unhappen. The person who was killed doesn't come back. Resolution is not restoration. It's simply the closing of a question that remained open for far too long. In the years since Marcus Hale's conviction, forensic genealogy has become an increasingly common tool in law enforcement. Dozens of cold cases have been solved using the same methods that identified him. There's ongoing debate about privacy concerns, about the ethics of using DNA databases created for family connection purposes to catch criminals. These are important conversations, necessary discussions about the balance between public safety and personal privacy. But for families like the Ruizes, for people who have spent decades wondering who killed someone they loved, the technology represents hope where there was none before. Evidence waits. That's the lesson of Elena's case. Physical evidence, carefully preserved, can speak even decades later when the right questions are finally asked with the right tools. But preservation requires care, attention, resources. It requires someone deciding that even though a case is cold, even though years have passed, the evidence still matters. It requires storage space and cataloging systems and policies that prevent old evidence from being discarded. It requires investigators who care enough to pull old files and look at them with fresh eyes. The story of Elena Ruiz is not unique. Across the country, there are thousands of unsolved homicides, thousands of families waiting for answers, thousands of boxes of evidence sitting in storage. Some of those cases will be solved using new technology and renewed effort. Many will not. The difference often comes down to resources, to which cases get attention and which don't, to which families have the means and energy to keep pushing for answers, and which families have been worn down by time and disappointment. There is something else that needs to be said about cases like Elena's. We focus on the resolution, on the arrest and conviction, because that's the dramatic conclusion. But the real story is everything that came before. The decades of investigation that went nowhere. The detectives who worked the case and moved on or retired with it still unsolved. The family members who called and wrote letters and refused to let anyone forget. The evidence technician who carefully stored those fibers and trace elements, not knowing if they would ever matter, but treating them as if they would. The cold case detective who pulled the file when she could have chosen a different one. Justice is not one person's work. It's not one breakthrough moment. It's the accumulation of countless small decisions, the persistence of people who refuse to accept that some questions will never have answers. It's the waitress in the diner who remembered Elena's last shift clearly enough to give investigators a precise timeline. It's the medical examiner who documented everything thoroughly even though the case seemed impossible. It's the family who never stopped believing that truth would eventually surface. Between the scrublands of Nevada and the mountains of New Mexico, there are more miles of emptiness than most people who haven't lived in the West can understand. Drive for hours and see nothing but landscape, beautiful and indifferent. In places like this, people can disappear completely. It happened in the 1970s with disturbing frequency. Young women hitchhiking, traveling alone, trusting in the basic goodness of strangers. Sometimes that trust was well placed. Often enough, it wasn't. High Ridge Pass in northern New Mexico was a stretch of mountain highway known for its dangerous curves and steep drop-offs. In good weather, it was merely treacherous. In winter, it was often closed entirely due to snow and ice. Small towns dotted the area, places where people lived and worked far from larger cities, sustaining themselves through ranching, logging, tourism in the summer months. It was isolated, rural, the kind of place where neighbors might be miles apart. Lila Moreno was 19 years old in the autumn of 1978. She'd grown up in one of the small towns along the pass, graduated from high school the previous spring, and was working at a motel in a slightly larger town 30 miles from home. She saved most of her money, planning to attend community college eventually, maybe move to Albuquerque or Santa Fe. For now, she was content with the rhythm of her life, the familiarity of the mountains, the small circle of friends she'd known since childhood. On a Friday evening in October, Lila finished her shift at the motel and decided to hitchhike home rather than wait for her father to pick her up. It was something she'd done before without incident. Hitchhiking was common then, particularly in rural areas where public transportation didn't exist and not everyone had access to a car. Lila stood by the side of the highway with her thumb out, wearing jeans and a jacket against the evening chill, her long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. A coworker saw her getting into a truck, a dark-colored pickup that the coworker didn't recognize. That was the last confirmed sighting of Lila Moreno alive. When she didn't come home that night, her parents weren't immediately worried. Lila was an adult, and occasionally she stayed with friends after work. But when Saturday came and went with no word, her father drove to the motel to find her. The manager said Lila had left work the previous evening, right on schedule. Now her parents were worried. By Sunday morning, they'd contacted the county sheriff. A missing person report was filed. Deputies began the work of trying to trace Lila's movements. They interviewed her coworkers, her friends, anyone who might have information. The coworker who'd seen her get into the truck gave a description, but it was vague. Dark-colored pickup, maybe blue or black, maybe a Ford or Chevy. There were dozens of trucks matching that description in the area. Search parties formed. locals who knew the terrain organizing into groups to comb the roadsides and forest. The highway patrol increased patrols along the pass, looking for any sign of Lila or the truck she'd gotten into. Days became a week. Hope began to fade. The mountains were vast, full of places where someone could be hidden and never found. Everyone knew this, though no one wanted to say it out loud. 2 weeks after Lila disappeared, a hunter found her body. She was lying in the trees about 50 yards from the highway, in a section of the pass where the road curved sharply and the shoulder widened into a small turnout. She'd been strangled. Her clothing was still mostly intact, her wallet gone, but her ID left behind. The scene was processed carefully, but there was limited physical evidence. No witnesses had seen anything. The truck Lila had gotten into was never identified. The investigation had nowhere to go. Lila's family was devastated. Her parents, Maria and Victor, had lost their only daughter. Lila's 3 younger brothers were suddenly living in a house where grief had taken up permanent residence. The funeral was held at the small Catholic church where Lila had been baptized and confirmed. The entire town seemed to attend. Afterward, people brought food and offered condolences and said the things people say when there are no adequate words. Then they went back to their lives, as people must, while the Morenos tried to figure out how to keep living in a world where their daughter's killer walked free. The investigation continued in the way that investigations with no leads do. The sheriff's deputies followed up on tips that came in, most of them useless, people reporting suspicious trucks or claiming to have information that went nowhere. They contacted law enforcement in neighboring counties, comparing Lila's case to others, looking for patterns that might suggest a serial offender. They found nothing definitive. As months turned into years, the investigation slowed and eventually went cold. The lead detective retired. The sheriff who'd overseen the case lost his re-election and moved out of state. The file on Lila Moreno joined others in storage, unsolved cases that represented failures of the system and tragedies for families. Maria and Victor Moreno visited their daughter's grave every week without fail. They never stopped hoping for answers. But as time passed, that hope became quieter, more resigned, less like expectation and more like habit. Lila's brothers grew up in the shadow of her death. The oldest, Miguel, became a police officer, driven by a need to do something to prevent other families from experiencing what his had endured. The middle brother, Carlos, left New Mexico entirely, unable to stay in a place so saturated with loss. The youngest, Antonio, stayed close to home, helping his parents as they aged, keeping his sister's memory alive in the way he lived his life, careful and protective. The 1970s became the 1980s, then the 1990s, then a new century. Technology advanced. DNA databases were created. Cold case units formed. But Lila's case remained unsolved. The evidence too limited, the leads too old. Her parents grew elderly. Maria developed dementia, forgetting sometimes that her daughter was gone, asking when Lila would be home. Victor cared for her through this, and on days when Maria remembered, when the grief was fresh all over again, he held her and they cried together, 40 years after their daughter's death. In 2018, a detective named James Ortega was assigned to the cold case unit in the county where Lila had been killed. James was from the area, had grown up hearing about the case, remembered his grandmother talking about it when he was a child. When he pulled the file, he felt the weight of it, all those decades of unanswered questions. He read through every page, studied the evidence inventory, and noted that biological samples had been collected from Lila's clothing. In 1978, DNA analysis hadn't existed. The samples had been stored but never tested. James submitted the evidence for modern DNA analysis. The results came back with a male profile. James entered it into the criminal DNA database. No match. He tried the forensic genealogy approach, submitting the profile to labs that specialized in building family trees from DNA. Months passed. James worked other cases, but kept Lila's file on his desk, a reminder of why the work mattered. The genealogical analysis eventually produced results. The DNA matched to a family tree that led James to a man named Caleb Norton. Caleb had lived in the area in the 1970s, worked as a truck driver, had a history of violence against women, though he'd never been convicted of anything serious. James felt a surge of possibility. This could be it. This could be the answer Lila's family had been waiting for. Then James looked up Caleb Norton's current status. Deceased. Caleb had died of a heart attack in 2006, 12 years earlier. He'd been buried in a small cemetery in Texas. James sat at his desk, staring at the information on his screen, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions. They had an answer. They knew, almost certainly, who had killed Lila Moreno. But there would be no arrest, no trial, no moment of confrontation or accountability. The person responsible was beyond justice. James contacted the FBI to request exhumation of Caleb Norton's body for DNA confirmation. The process took months, involved legal wrangling and coordination between multiple agencies. Eventually, permission was granted. The exhumation was conducted. DNA was extracted and tested. The match was confirmed. Caleb Norton had killed Lila Moreno. James Ortega drove to the Moreno family home to deliver the news in person. Victor Moreno was 92 years old, still living in the same house he'd raised his children in. Maria had died 2 years earlier, never knowing who had killed their daughter. Victor's sons were there, Miguel and Antonio. Carlos flew in from California when he heard the detective was coming. James sat in the living room where probably dozens of detectives and deputies had sat over the past 40 years, delivering updates that led nowhere. This time was different. This time, he had an answer. He explained about the DNA, the genealogical analysis, Caleb Norton. He showed them a photograph of the man, a driver's license photo from the 1970s. Victor stared at it, memorizing the face of the person who'd taken his daughter. "Is he in jail?" Victor asked. James had to tell him no. Had to explain that Caleb Norton was dead, had been dead for more than a decade. He watched Victor's face as this information registered. The old man nodded slowly, his expression hard to read. After a long moment, Victor said, "At least we know. After all this time, we finally know." But there was no satisfaction in his voice, no sense of relief. Just weariness and a kind of hollow acknowledgement. The family asked questions. James answered what he could. He told them about Caleb Norton's history, the other women he'd hurt, the pattern of violence. He told them that if Norton had been caught in 1978, Lila might not have been his last victim, that other families had probably suffered because he'd remained free. None of this made the news any easier to hear. Miguel, the son who'd become a police officer, asked if there was any way to pursue charges posthumously, any mechanism for officially holding Norton accountable. James had to explain that the criminal justice system doesn't prosecute the dead. The case could be officially closed, the findings documented, but there would be no trial, no conviction, no formal justice. Just knowledge. After James left, the Moreno family sat together in the living room that had seen so much grief. They looked at each other, these men who'd spent their entire adult lives shaped by their sister's death, and their elderly father who'd waited 40 years for this moment. What were they supposed to feel? Relief that they finally knew? Anger that the person responsible had lived free for decades before dying peacefully? Frustration that there would never be a trial, never be a moment in court where Lila's life and death were officially acknowledged? Victor picked up a framed photograph of Lila from the side table, the one that had sat in the same spot for 40 years. She was smiling, young, full of the future she'd been denied. "I wish your mother could have known," he said quietly. She deserved to know. His sons didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would make any of it better. The news of the identification made local headlines, another cold case solved through DNA technology. Reporters called the Moreno family for comment. Miguel spoke to a few of them, explained that while they were grateful to know what happened, it was complicated to feel closure when the person responsible was beyond accountability. The reporters mostly wanted the dramatic angle, the solved mystery, the triumph of technology. They were less interested in the messiness of emotions, the way knowing didn't actually heal anything. Detective James Ortega officially closed the case. In the file, he wrote a detailed summary of the investigation, the DNA analysis, the genealogical work that had led to Caleb Norton's identification. He noted that while criminal prosecution was impossible due to the suspect's death, the case was resolved to the fullest extent possible. He included copies of all the documentation, the DNA reports, the family tree analysis, everything that demonstrated the chain of evidence. Then he put the file in storage, another closed case in a long line of them. But James thought about it often. The look on Victor Moreno's face when he'd learned the killer was dead. The way the family had struggled to figure out how to feel about information they'd wanted for decades, but that came in a form that offered no real justice. This was the reality of cold cases sometimes. Answers arrived too late, or in forms that couldn't provide the closure families hoped for. The truth mattered. Knowing mattered, but it didn't fix anything. In the months after learning about Caleb Norton, the Moreno family tried to process what they'd been told. Victor talked with a priest, trying to make sense of it all through his faith. Miguel researched Caleb Norton, finding what information he could about the man's life, trying to understand who had killed his sister. He learned that Norton had been married 3 times, divorced twice, that he'd been arrested for assault several times, but always got probation or short sentences. He learned that Norton had other victims, women who'd been attacked but survived, whose reports had been filed, and then largely ignored by law enforcement in an era when violence against women was often minimized. What haunted Miguel most was the thought that if Norton had been properly investigated after those early assaults, if the system had taken those women's reports seriously, Lila might still be alive. The failure wasn't just in solving the case after the fact. The failure was in prevention, in the casual dismissal of violence that allowed men like Norton to keep hurting people. Miguel couldn't change the past, but he could do his job better, take every report seriously, push back against the institutional indifference he sometimes saw in his colleagues. Antonio, the youngest brother, dealt with the information differently. He felt a strange kind of relief, not that justice had been served, but that the wondering was over. For his entire adult life, there had been this question hanging over everything. Who killed my sister? Now there was an answer. The answer was inadequate and frustrating, but it was something. He could stop imagining scenarios, stop wondering if he'd seen the killer at the grocery store or passed him on the street. Caleb Norton was dead. He couldn't hurt anyone else. That was something. Carlos, who'd left New Mexico and built a life elsewhere, felt mostly anger. He'd left partially because he couldn't stand living in a place where his sister's killer walked free, where the person responsible might be someone he saw every day without knowing it. Now he learned that the killer had been identified but was beyond punishment. It felt like another injustice on top of the original one. He'd spent decades running from the unresolved nature of Lila's death, and even with resolution, there was no real peace. Victor Moreno died 8 months after learning who killed his daughter. He was 93. His sons found him in his favorite chair, a photograph of Lila in his lap. At his funeral, they buried him next to Maria, and not far from Lila. The priest talked about a family reunited in heaven, about suffering ended and peace finally found. Miguel wanted to believe it. Antonio tried to believe it. Carlos wasn't sure what he believed anymore. The case of Lila Moreno demonstrates something essential about cold case investigations and justice itself. Sometimes the best outcome we can achieve is knowledge. Not punishment, not confrontation, not even the satisfaction of seeing someone held accountable. Just knowledge. The truth of what happened, the identity of who did it, the end of wondering. It's not enough. It's never enough. But for families who've lived with absolute uncertainty, even inadequate answers can matter. There's a different kind of violence that happens when death occurs in public, when many people witness it, but understanding remains elusive. The modern world is saturated with surveillance, with cameras and recordings and digital traces of nearly everything we do. It would seem that this makes truth easier to determine. But information is not the same as understanding. Sometimes, an abundance of data creates more confusion rather than less. South Point Junction, Arizona, was a mid-sized city, the kind of place where urban sprawl met desert landscape, where shopping centers and housing developments pushed outward into land that had been empty scrubland a generation earlier. It was hot most of the year, the kind of relentless heat that made people move quickly from air-conditioned car to air-conditioned building, minimizing time spent outside. The city had grown rapidly, population doubling in 20 years, bringing with it all the complexities of modern urban life. Isaiah Coleman, who went by Zay, was 23 years old in the summer of 2024. He worked at a warehouse, the kind of massive fulfillment center that had become common in cities like South Point, processing orders for an online retail giant. He lived with 2 roommates in an apartment complex near the highway. He had a girlfriend, Tasha, who he'd been dating for 2 years. He played basketball on weekends with a group of friends he'd known since high school. By all accounts, he was an ordinary young man living an ordinary life. On a Saturday afternoon in June, Zay was driving through an intersection in a busy commercial area of South Point. It was around 3 in the afternoon, bright sunshine, temperatures above 100 degrees. Traffic was moderate, people running errands, heading to or from shopping centers and restaurants. The intersection had traffic signals, crosswalks, turn lanes. It was, in every way, a normal urban intersection on a normal day. What happened next was witnessed by dozens of people and captured by multiple cameras, including traffic cameras, security cameras from nearby businesses, and cell phones held by people who happened to be recording for other reasons or who started recording when they realized something was happening. Despite all of this documentation, despite all these witnesses, the exact sequence of events remained disputed. What is certain is that gunshots were fired. Zay's car, which had been stopped at a red light, lurched forward and crashed into the car in front of it. People nearby ducked, ran, screamed. Some dropped to the ground. Others pulled out their phones. Within seconds, 911 calls started pouring in. Witnesses reported hearing multiple shots, anywhere from 3 to 7, depending on who was asked. Some people said they saw a person on foot. Others insisted the shots came from another vehicle. The accounts varied wildly. Police arrived within minutes. They found Zay slumped over the wheel of his car, shot multiple times. Paramedics worked on him at the scene, but his injuries were catastrophic. He was pronounced dead before they could get him to the hospital. He was 23 years old. His girlfriend, Tasha, was at home when she got the call from police. She would later say that the moment she answered the phone and heard the detective's voice, she knew. She just knew. The investigation began immediately. Police cordoned off the intersection, preserving the scene. They collected shell casings, documented the trajectory of bullets, photographed everything. They began the process of interviewing witnesses, taking statements from everyone who'd been in the area. They pulled footage from every camera they could find. The abundance of evidence should have made this straightforward. Instead, it created layers of complication. The witness statements were all over the place. Some people said they'd seen a man running away after the shots were fired, heading into the parking lot of a shopping center. Others said they'd seen a car speeding away, though descriptions of the car varied dramatically. A white sedan, a dark SUV, a truck. Some witnesses said the shooter was on Zay's driver's side. Others said the shots came from the passenger side. A few people insisted there were multiple shooters. The chaos and fear of the moment had fragmented perception, each person seeing and remembering the event differently. The video footage was similarly problematic. Traffic cameras showed the intersection from a distance, capturing the general flow of vehicles, but without enough detail to identify specific people or actions. Security camera footage from a nearby strip mall showed people running, cars moving, but the angle didn't capture the actual shooting. A cell phone video that went viral online showed the aftermath, people screaming and taking cover, but nothing useful about who had fired the shots or why. Detectives worked the case hard. They interviewed Zay's family, friends, co-workers, trying to understand if he'd been targeted or if this was random. Tasha told them that Zay hadn't mentioned any problems, any conflicts with anyone. He'd gone to work that morning, come home, eaten lunch, then left to run errands. She'd kissed him goodbye. That was the last time she saw him alive. His mother, Patricia, was beside herself with grief and confusion. Her son had been killed in broad daylight in front of dozens of people, and no one could explain exactly what had happened or why. The police looked into Zay's background. No criminal record, no gang affiliations, no involvement in drugs or anything illegal. He worked, paid his bills, spent time with family and friends. He was, by every measure, exactly what he appeared to be, a young man trying to build a life. There was no obvious motive for anyone to kill him, no indication that this was anything other than either a case of mistaken identity or random violence. As days passed, tips came in. People called with information, most of it useless or contradictory. Someone reported seeing a suspicious person in the area days before the shooting. Someone else claimed to know who did it, but couldn't provide any details. The police followed every lead, but nothing developed into anything solid. The case started to feel like it was slipping away, despite all the witnesses and cameras and evidence. The frustration for investigators was acute. This hadn't happened in a dark alley at 3 in the morning. This had happened at a busy intersection in the middle of the afternoon. There were witnesses everywhere. There was video from multiple angles. And yet, they couldn't piece together a clear picture of what had occurred or who was responsible. The abundance of information created noise rather than clarity, each piece of evidence adding confusion rather than resolution. For Zay's family, the investigation became its own kind of torment. They wanted answers. They wanted someone arrested. They wanted justice for a young man who'd done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that this might not happen. The detectives were still working the case, still following leads, but nothing was breaking. The case was at risk of going cold despite all the attention, all the evidence, all the witnesses. The community response was complicated. There were vigils for Zay, social media posts mourning him and calling for justice. But there was also speculation, rumors spreading online about who might have killed him and why. Some of these rumors were viciously racist, assuming without any evidence that Zay must have been involved in something criminal. Others spun elaborate conspiracy theories. The noise made it harder for police to investigate, harder for the family to grieve. Tasha found herself reading through social media comments, a habit she knew was unhealthy but couldn't stop. She saw people who'd never met Zay making assumptions about him, judging him, creating narratives that had nothing to do with reality. She wanted to respond to every comment, correct every false assumption, but there were too many. The internet had turned her boyfriend's death into a spectacle, something for strangers to dissect and debate. It was violating in a way she hadn't anticipated. Patricia, Zay's mother, stopped reading the news coverage after a while. Every article seemed to focus on the mystery of the case, the abundance of witnesses who couldn't agree on what they'd seen, the challenge facing investigators. None of them focused on Zay, on who he was, what he'd meant to the people who loved him. He'd been reduced to a victim, a case number, a tragedy, but not a person. She kept photographs of him around her house, tangible reminders that he had existed, that he had mattered beyond the circumstances of his death. The first anniversary of Zay's death came and went. The case remained unsolved. Detectives still listed it as active, but there had been no major developments in months. The initial flood of tips had dried up. The media had moved on to other stories. The family held a memorial gathering, inviting everyone who'd known Zay. People came, shared stories, cried together. But underneath it all was the bitter knowledge that the person or people who'd killed him were still out there, free, unpunished. This is where the story of Isaiah Coleman currently stands, unresolved and unfinished. The investigation is ongoing, but there's no telling if it will ever be solved. The abundance of witnesses and video footage, which should have been assets, created complexity that investigators haven't been able to untangle. Everyone saw something, but no one saw the same thing. The truth is somewhere in all that data, but extracting it has proven extraordinarily difficult. Cases like Zay's challenge our assumptions about modern evidence and surveillance. We think that cameras everywhere and constant documentation make crimes easier to solve. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes the sheer volume of information becomes its own obstacle. Sorting through hundreds of hours of video footage, reconciling contradictory witness statements, filtering signal from noise requires resources and time and expertise. And even with all that, success isn't guaranteed. For the families of victims in unsolved cases, the lack of resolution is a particular kind of agony. At least with cold cases from decades past, there's a kind of resignation that comes with time, an acceptance that the investigation is no longer active. But with recent cases where police are still actively working, there's ongoing uncertainty. Any day could bring a break in the case, or it might never come. The family is stuck in a perpetual state of waiting, unable to move forward, but unable to accept that answers might never arrive. There's also the public nature of cases like Zay's to contend with. When someone is killed in a busy intersection with dozens of witnesses, it becomes a community event. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone has a theory. The family can't grieve privately because their tragedy is public, discussed, and debated by people who have no connection to them or their loved one. This adds another layer of trauma, the feeling that even grief isn't entirely yours, that it's been claimed by the public discourse. The violence itself is one horror. The investigation is another. But the ongoing uncertainty might be the worst part. Families can eventually make peace with even terrible truths if they know what those truths are. But not knowing, existing in permanent limbo, never being sure if today might be the day they get a call from police with news, or if they'll spend the rest of their lives wondering. That's a specific torture that's hard for outsiders to understand. Zay's case remains open. Detectives still work on it when new information comes in or when they have time between other cases. His family still hopes that someday, someone will come forward with the information that breaks everything open, that leads to an arrest and trial and some form of justice. But as time passes, that hope becomes harder to maintain. The case isn't cold yet, but it's cooling, slipping from active investigation toward the filing cabinet where unsolved cases wait, maybe forever. If you've been watching this far, I want you to take a moment and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like these that need to be told. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. The support you show helps us continue bringing these stories to light. Now, let's continue. The digital age has transformed how we interact with each other, how we work, how we form relationships, and unfortunately, how people can harm one another. Technology that connects us can also be used to control, to surveil, to stalk. The traces we leave online, which feel ephemeral and intangible, can become evidence of both danger and wrongdoing. This is a story about how our digital lives have become inseparable from our physical ones, and how that created both risk and resolution in a case that might have been impossible to solve in an earlier era. Rainhaven, Oregon, was a city of about 100,000 people, situated in the Willamette Valley where rainfall was abundant and the landscape stayed green most of the year. It was a college town, home to a mid-sized university, with all the characteristics that came with that: coffee shops and bookstores, a downtown with murals and art galleries, a mix of longtime residents and students cycling through every few years. It was generally considered a safe place, the kind of city where people felt comfortable walking alone at night, where crime rates were lower than national averages. Naomi Keller was 31 years old and worked as an advocate for survivors of domestic violence. She'd been doing this work for 5 years, employed by a nonprofit that provided services to people escaping abusive relationships. Her job involved direct support, helping clients navigate the legal system, find housing, access resources. She also did community education, giving presentations about recognizing abuse, about how to help friends or family members who might be in dangerous situations. It was demanding work, emotionally exhausting, but Naomi felt it was important that she was making a tangible difference in people's lives. Naomi had a public presence that came with her advocacy work. She maintained professional social media accounts where she shared resources, posted about events, discussed issues related to domestic violence and relationship abuse. She was careful about her personal information, didn't post photos of her home or details about her daily routine, maintained boundaries between her professional online presence and her private life. She'd been trained in digital safety as part of her work, understood the risks, took precautions. Evan Brooks had worked at the same nonprofit as Naomi for about a year, from early 2022 to early 2023. He was in an administrative role, handling scheduling and coordination. Colleagues described him as quiet, competent, somewhat socially awkward but professional. When his position was eliminated due to budget cuts, he left without apparent drama. Naomi had interacted with him occasionally during his time there, but they weren't friends, just co-workers who'd been cordial but not close. After Evan left the organization, Naomi didn't think much about him. She was focused on her own work, on the clients she was helping, on the ongoing challenges of doing difficult work with limited resources. She dated occasionally, maintained friendships, spent time with her family who lived in the area. Her life continued in its regular patterns. She didn't notice, at first, that someone was paying very close attention to those patterns. It started with small things that seemed coincidental. Running into Evan at a coffee shop she frequented. Seeing him at a grocery store she went to regularly. He'd wave, say hello, exchange a few minutes of small talk about what he was doing now, how things were going. Naomi was friendly but brief, not wanting to encourage extended conversation, but also not wanting to be rude. After all, they'd worked together. It made sense that they might occasionally cross paths in a city the size of Rainhaven. But the encounters became more frequent. Evan showed up at a community presentation Naomi gave at the library. He attended a fundraiser for her organization, though he no longer worked there. He started commenting on her professional social media posts. Always appropriate comments, but numerous, showing up on nearly everything she shared. Naomi began to feel uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Nothing Evan was doing was overtly threatening. He wasn't sending inappropriate messages or making unwanted advances. But something felt off. Naomi mentioned it to a coworker, Jen, who she was close with. Jen suggested that maybe Evan was just trying to maintain professional connections, that he was networking in case he wanted to return to nonprofit work. But Jen also said to trust her gut, that if something felt wrong, it was worth paying attention to. They discussed whether Naomi should say something to Evan directly, ask him to limit contact. Naomi decided to start with smaller boundary setting, responding less to his online comments, keeping their occasional in-person encounters even briefer. The boundary setting seemed to have the opposite effect. Evan's comments on her social media became more frequent, more personal. He started sending her direct messages, nothing explicitly inappropriate but questions about her day, comments about things she'd posted, suggestions that they should get coffee to catch up. Naomi stopped responding to the messages. The messages continued anyway. She blocked him on her professional accounts. He created new accounts and continued reaching out. Now Naomi was genuinely concerned. This wasn't coincidental running into each other. This was persistent, escalating contact despite her clear lack of interest in maintaining it. She documented everything, taking screenshots of messages, noting dates and times of encounters. This was part of her training, the advice she gave to clients. Document everything, create a paper trail. If you need to get a restraining order or involve law enforcement, you need evidence. She never thought she'd be following this advice for her own situation. Naomi went to the police to file a report. The officer who took her statement was sympathetic, but explained that what Evan was doing didn't quite meet the threshold for stalking under Oregon law. He hadn't threatened her. He hadn't shown up at her home. His behavior was concerning, but without more explicit evidence of intent to cause fear or harm, there wasn't much they could do. The officer suggested she keep documenting, that if Evan's behavior escalated, she should come back immediately. Frustrated, Naomi reached out to an attorney who specialized in restraining orders. The attorney reviewed what she'd documented and said they could try for a restraining order, but judges were inconsistent about granting them in situations like this. Evan's behavior was clearly unwanted, but proving that it was threatening enough to warrant legal intervention was tricky. The attorney advised her to continue documenting and to be very explicit in any communication with Evan that his contact was unwanted. Naomi sent Evan a formal message through email, clearly stating that she did not want any further contact with him, that he should not message her, should not approach her in public, should not attend events where he knew she would be. She kept the message factual and firm, not emotional. She CC'd her attorney. Evan's response came within an hour. He said he was sorry she felt that way, that he'd only been trying to be friendly, that he wouldn't bother her anymore. The tone was hurt, slightly accusatory, as if she was being unreasonable. For a few weeks, the contact stopped. Naomi felt cautiously relieved. Maybe the formal message had worked. Maybe Evan had gotten the point and would move on. But then her car was vandalized in the parking lot of her apartment complex. Someone had keyed long scratches into the paint on both sides. There was no evidence it was Evan, but Naomi's instinct told her it was. She reported it to police, mentioned her concerns about Evan, but without proof, there was nothing they could do beyond filing a vandalism report. A week later, Naomi's email and social media accounts were hacked. Whoever got into them changed her passwords, locked her out, began sending messages to her contacts from her accounts. The messages were designed to be embarrassing, claiming she was in crisis, asking people for money, sharing fabricated personal information. It took Naomi days to regain control of her accounts, to notify everyone who'd received the fake messages, to restore her professional reputation. This level of harassment was clearly beyond coincidental bad luck. Someone with technical knowledge was deliberately targeting her. Naomi went back to the police with this new information. A detective who specialized in cybercrimes got involved. He examined what had happened with her accounts, looked at the access logs and IP addresses. He asked Naomi who she suspected. She told him about Evan, about the escalating pattern of unwanted contact, the formal cease and desist message she'd sent. The detective did some investigating into Evan Brooks. He found that Evan had significant computer skills, had worked in IT before moving into nonprofit administration. He also found a restraining order in California from 3 years earlier, filed by a former girlfriend who'd claimed Evan was harassing and stalking her. The pattern was there. The detective told Naomi they would talk to Evan, question him about the hacking. But he also warned her to be very careful, to vary her routine, to let trusted friends know what was going on. When detectives interviewed Evan, he denied everything. Denied hacking Naomi's accounts, denied vandalizing her car, claimed the messages after Naomi had asked him to stop contact had been misunderstood. He presented himself as a victim of misunderstanding, suggested that Naomi might be unstable, creating drama for attention. The detectives didn't believe him, but belief isn't the same as proof. They couldn't arrest him based on suspicion and pattern alone. They needed evidence. Naomi installed security cameras at her apartment. She varied her schedule as much as her job allowed. She told her supervisor at work what was happening, and they implemented additional security measures at the office, requiring visitors to check in, installing cameras. Naomi hated living this way, constantly vigilant, always looking over her shoulder. But she also knew, from her work with domestic violence survivors, that this kind of hypervigilance could be the difference between safety and danger. One evening in October 2023, Naomi was walking to her car after work. It was already dark, the days getting shorter as autumn progressed. She had her keys in her hand, her phone in her pocket, following the safety protocols she'd taught countless clients. As she approached her car, she saw someone standing near it. Even in the dim light of the parking lot, she recognized Evan. Naomi stopped walking. Her heart rate spiked. She pulled out her phone, ready to call 911. Evan saw her movement and put his hands up, as if to show he wasn't threatening. "I just want to talk," he said. "Please. You've been ignoring me, blocking me, telling lies about me to the police. I just want a chance to explain." Naomi didn't respond. She turned and walked quickly back toward the office building, hitting the emergency contact she'd set up to speed dial 911. The operator answered, and Naomi explained in a calm but urgent voice that she was being followed by someone who'd been harassing her, gave her location, requested police immediately. She reached the office building and went inside, where her supervisor, Mark, was still working late. Mark took one look at her face and asked what was wrong. Police arrived within minutes. They found Evan still in the parking lot, sitting on the hood of Naomi's car. When officers approached him, he was cooperative, explaining that he just wanted to talk to Naomi, that there'd been a misunderstanding between them. The officers arrested him for trespassing and violating the restraining order Naomi had finally been granted after the hacking incident. Evan went without resistance, still maintaining that he'd done nothing wrong. This arrest changed things. With Evan in custody, detectives could get warrants to search his apartment and his electronic devices. What they found was disturbing. Evan had been conducting extensive surveillance of Naomi. He'd installed tracking software on her phone during the period when they'd worked together, before he'd left the organization. The software allowed him to see her location, read her messages, access her photos. He'd been monitoring her for over a year. His apartment contained printed maps marking Naomi's regular routes, the locations she frequented. He had folders of printed photos of her, taken from social media, but also photos he'd clearly taken himself, covertly, showing her at the grocery store, at the gas station, walking in her neighborhood. His computer contained detailed logs of her activities, almost like research notes. He'd documented her schedule, her habits, her social connections. The depth of his obsession was chilling. Detectives also found evidence connecting Evan to the car vandalism and the account hacking. There were photos of Naomi's damaged car on his phone, taken before the vandalism was reported. The IP address used to access Naomi's accounts traced back to his apartment. There were searches on his computer about how to hack email accounts, how to avoid detection. Everything Naomi had suspected was confirmed by digital evidence that Evan had been careless enough to preserve. Evan was charged with stalking, harassment, computer crimes, and several other offenses. The district attorney built a case using the digital trail Evan had left, the physical evidence from his apartment, and testimony from Naomi and others about his escalating behavior. Evan's attorney tried to argue that his client had mental health issues, that he hadn't intended to harm Naomi, only to maintain contact with someone he considered a friend. The argument didn't hold up against the evidence of calculated, sustained harassment. The trial took place in the summer of 2024. Naomi had to testify, had to relive the months of fear and violation, had to describe how Evan's actions had impacted her life. It was difficult, sitting in a courtroom across from him, speaking publicly about something that felt intensely private. But she was also angry, and that anger gave her strength. She looked at Evan directly while she testified, refusing to let him make her feel small or afraid. The jury deliberated for less than a day, guilty on all counts. Evan showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with additional time on supervised release after that, including permanent restraining orders preventing him from contacting Naomi. The judge, during sentencing, explicitly stated that Evan's actions represented a serious danger, that his methodical surveillance and persistence despite clear boundaries being set demonstrated an escalating pattern that very likely could have ended in physical violence. After the trial, Naomi spoke to reporters. She wanted to be clear about several things. First, that she had done nothing to encourage Evan's attention. There was no prior romantic relationship, no mixed signals, nothing that could be construed as invitation. Second, that the technology that had made Evan's surveillance possible was something everyone should be aware of. Tracking software, spyware, hacking tools were readily available, and people needed to know how to protect themselves. Third, that believing victims of harassment and stalking was crucial. She'd gone to police multiple times before anything could be done, and if Evan had escalated to physical violence before they'd gathered enough evidence, the system would have failed her. The case received significant media attention, partially because of the digital surveillance aspect, partially because Naomi herself was an advocate who'd been victimized. It sparked conversations about online harassment, about stalking laws that needed updating for the digital age, about how technology companies could do more to prevent the misuse of their platforms and products for harassment. Naomi participated in these conversations, using her experience to advocate for better protections and more serious responses to stalking and harassment complaints. But privately, Naomi struggled. The violation of having been watched so extensively, of having her privacy invaded so thoroughly, affected her deeply. She had trouble trusting that she was truly safe, found herself constantly checking for signs of surveillance, experiencing anxiety in situations that should have been routine. She went to therapy, worked through the trauma, but it was a long process. The trial had brought closure in terms of legal justice, but emotional recovery took much longer. The case of Naomi Keller illustrates several critical points about crime and justice in the modern era. Technology creates new vulnerabilities, new ways for people to harm each other without physical presence. But that same technology also creates evidence, digital trails that can be used to establish patterns of behavior and hold perpetrators accountable. Naomi's careful documentation, her screenshots and notes, and saved messages were crucial in building the case against Evan. There's also a lesson here about believing people when they report harassment or threatening behavior. Naomi went to police early, when Evan's actions were concerning but not yet clearly illegal. She was dismissed initially, told that what he was doing didn't meet the threshold for intervention. How many cases of escalating harassment end in violence because the system doesn't or can't respond until that threshold is crossed? How many people are told their fear is overreaction, their concerns are exaggerated, only to have those concerns prove devastatingly accurate? Finally, there's the question of victim blaming that so often accompanies cases like this. Naomi had a public online presence because of her work. After her case became news, there were people who suggested she'd brought the harassment on herself by being visible online, by posting publicly, by being accessible. This completely misses the point. Having a professional online presence, sharing information publicly, being visible, none of these things are invitations for harassment or stalking. Naomi did nothing wrong. Evan chose to misuse technology to violate her privacy and safety. The responsibility lies entirely with him. 3 years after Evan Brooks was convicted, Naomi is still doing advocacy work, though she's moved to a different organization and focuses now on digital safety and cyberstalking. She gives workshops on protecting your online presence, recognizing signs of digital harassment, documenting evidence for legal action. She's turned her traumatic experience into a platform for helping others avoid similar situations or know how to respond if they find themselves targeted. It's meaningful work, but she admits there are days when it's hard, When talking about surveillance, and stalking brings back the fear and violation she felt. Evan remains in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 2031. Naomi has requested that she be notified before any parole hearing so she can submit a statement, can ensure that those making decisions about his release understand the full scope of what he did and the impact it had. She doesn't know if she'll attend the hearing in person or submit a written statement. She has years to decide. For now, she focuses on her work, her healing, her life moving forward. The conviction in Naomi's case was possible because of the evidence trail Evan left. Digital surveillance creates records. Hacking leaves traces. Metadata tells stories about who accessed what and when. But this kind of evidence requires expertise to find and interpret, requires resources and time. Not every victim of cyberstalking or digital harassment will have access to investigators who know how to trace IP addresses or examine device logs. Not every police department has cybercrime units. There's a gap between the technology that enables these crimes and the capacity of the justice system to respond to them. There's also the reality that many people don't realize they're being surveilled until significant damage has been done. Tracking software can be installed on devices without the user's knowledge. Social media provides abundant information about people's habits and locations. Online harassment can escalate rapidly. By the time someone realizes they're being stalked or harassed, the pattern has often been ongoing for a while. Education about digital safety, about recognizing warning signs, about protecting your information is crucial but not widely accessible. Naomi's case had what might be considered a good outcome within the context of crime and justice. She survived. Her stalker was caught and convicted. She's been able to rebuild her sense of safety, however imperfectly. But it's worth acknowledging that this outcome required Naomi to do everything right. Document meticulously, report persistently, maintain boundaries clearly. It required law enforcement to eventually take her seriously and investigate thoroughly. It required prosecutors to bring appropriate charges and juries to convict. Any one of those things could have gone differently, and the outcome could have been tragedy rather than justice. The question that haunts cases like Naomi's is this: how do we prevent these situations rather than just responding after harm has been done? Evan had a prior restraining order from a previous relationship. He had a history of boundary violations. But that information wasn't flagged when he applied for a job at a nonprofit working with vulnerable populations. There's no registry of people who've been found to be stalkers or harassers. No system for sharing information between jurisdictions. Someone can have a restraining order in one state and move to another state, and the new community has no way of knowing about that history. These systemic gaps allow people like Evan to continue harmful patterns across time and geography. Better information sharing between states, more comprehensive background check systems, registries for certain types of offenses, these could potentially prevent some cases. But there are also privacy concerns, worries about false accusations, or overreach. Finding the balance between protection and privacy is complicated, and we as a society haven't figured it out yet. What's clear is that technology has changed the landscape of interpersonal harm. Stalking no longer requires following someone physically. Harassment can be conducted entirely online. Control can be exerted through screens and software. And victims are often not believed until the evidence is overwhelming, until the danger is undeniable, sometimes until it's too late. We need to do better. We need to believe people sooner, respond to concerning behavior before it escalates, provide resources for those being targeted. Naomi's story is difficult but important. It shows both the vulnerability created by our digital lives and the possibility of using that same technology to hold perpetrators accountable. It demonstrates the importance of documentation, of persistence, of clear boundaries. It reveals the gaps in our systems and the need for improvement. And it reminds us that visibility is not consent, that having a public presence is not an invitation for invasion, that victims of harassment and stalking are never responsible for the actions of those who harm them. Now we turn to a different kind of story, one where the victim wasn't targeted because of a personal connection, but because of what they knew, because their curiosity led them somewhere dangerous. This is about the collision between individual conscience and institutional power, about what happens when someone uncovers wrongdoing and becomes a threat to those who benefit from secrecy. It's a reminder that sometimes seeking truth comes with a cost that shouldn't have to be paid. Lake Alder Basin, Vermont, was a rural area in the northern part of the state, characterized by dense forests, scattered small towns, and lakes that drew tourists in summer and hunters in fall. The population was sparse, the economy dependent on tourism, logging, and small-scale agriculture. It was beautiful country, the kind of place that looked like a postcard, where people chose to live because they valued quiet and nature over convenience and urban amenities. Daniel Reed was a graduate student in environmental science, 27 years old, conducting research on water quality in lakes and streams throughout the region. He was working on his master's thesis, focusing on how different types of land use affected aquatic ecosystems. His research involved collecting water samples, testing for various pollutants and contaminants, mapping the sources of runoff and contamination. It was meticulous work, requiring patience and attention to detail, work that Daniel found deeply satisfying. Daniel had grown up in Vermont, loved the state, and felt a strong personal investment in protecting its natural resources. His research wasn't just academic, it was personal. He wanted his work to contribute to better environmental policies, to help protect the lakes and forests he'd grown up exploring. He was idealistic in the way that many young researchers are, believing that good data could lead to good policy, that facts could change minds and behaviors. In the summer of 2022, Daniel was collecting samples from a stream that fed into Lake Alder. He noticed that the water had a strange odor and discoloration. He took multiple samples, tested them in the lab, and found elevated levels of industrial chemicals, particularly heavy metals and volatile organic compounds. This was concerning. The area around this particular stream was mostly forested, with no obvious source for this type of contamination. Daniel began investigating further, trying to identify where the pollutants were coming from. He hiked upstream, following the water course, looking for potential sources. About 3 miles from where he'd first noticed the contamination, he found what appeared to be an illegal dumping site. Someone had been disposing of industrial waste in a small clearing in the forest, barrels and containers hidden among the trees. The waste had been leaching into the ground and into the stream. Daniel photographed everything, documented the location, collected samples of the waste material for analysis. Back in the lab, analysis confirmed that the waste was industrial, likely from manufacturing or chemical processing. Daniel reported his findings to the state environmental agency. He provided all his documentation, his photographs, his test results, the GPS coordinates of the dumping site. He expected a quick response, an investigation, cleanup, prosecution of whoever was responsible. That's not what happened. Weeks passed with no apparent action. Daniel called the agency multiple times, asking about the status of the investigation. He was told they were looking into it, that these things took time. But there was something evasive in the responses, something that made Daniel uneasy. He started doing more research on his own, trying to figure out who might be responsible for the dumping. Through property records and business registrations, Daniel traced the land where the dumping was occurring to a company called Nordic Processing, which operated a manufacturing facility about 20 miles away. Nordic Processing produced components for electronics manufacturing, work that involved various chemicals and generated hazardous waste. Proper disposal of hazardous waste is expensive, heavily regulated, and requires detailed documentation. Illegal dumping is cheaper, but carries serious legal penalties if caught. Daniel found that Nordic Processing had a history of environmental violations in other states, fines for improper waste disposal, citations for exceeding permitted pollution limits. The company had been acquired a few years earlier by a larger corporation with political connections and deep pockets. This started to explain the lack of response from the state agency. Nordic Processing had the resources to fight any accusations, the connections to make problems go away quietly. Daniel couldn't let this go. He believed that environmental crimes harmed everyone, that companies shouldn't be able to poison water systems just because they had money and influence. He compiled a detailed report of everything he'd found, the contamination data, the location of the illegal dump site, the connection to Nordic Processing, the company's history of violations. He sent copies to the state environmental agency, to the EPA, to the state attorney general's office, and to a couple of local journalists who covered environmental issues. The story was picked up by a regional newspaper. The article detailed Daniel's findings, included quotes from him about the contamination levels and the potential health impacts, mentioned Nordic Processing by name. The article got attention. Environmental groups called for investigation. State representatives made public statements. Pressure mounted on the relevant agencies to respond. Nordic Processing issued a statement denying responsibility, claiming the dumping site was on land they'd previously sold, that they had no connection to the waste found there. They suggested that Daniel's findings might be inaccurate, that water testing was complex and easily misinterpreted by inexperienced researchers. They didn't outright call him incompetent, but the implication was clear. Daniel was furious but maintained his composure, providing additional documentation to journalists and agencies that confirmed his methodology and findings. Then Daniel started receiving threats. Anonymous emails telling him to drop his investigation, to stop talking to reporters. Phone calls from blocked numbers. Voices telling him he was making powerful people angry, that he should be careful. Daniel reported the threats to police, but was told there wasn't much they could do about anonymous communications unless there was a specific, credible threat of violence. He changed his phone number, improved his digital security, told his advisor and colleagues what was happening. In late September, Daniel went out on Lake Alder in a small boat to collect more water samples. He wanted additional data points to strengthen the case against Nordic Processing, to make it impossible for them to deny responsibility. He left early in the morning, planning to spend several hours on the water. His girlfriend, Sarah, was used to his long days in the field and wasn't concerned when he didn't return by afternoon. By evening, when Daniel still hadn't come back and wasn't answering his phone, Sarah started to worry. She drove to the boat launch where he'd left from and found his truck parked there. The boat was gone. She called the lake patrol, and they began a search. They found Daniel's boat adrift about a mile from shore, the motor off, the boat partially swamped with water. Daniel wasn't in the boat. His research equipment was there, his backpack, but no Daniel. Search and rescue teams scoured the lake through the night and the following days. Divers searched the areas where the boat had been found. The lake was deep and cold, visibility poor. After a week, Daniel's body was recovered from the lake. The medical examiner determined cause of death was drowning. There were injuries consistent with hitting his head, possibly on the side of the boat or the motor. The death was ruled accidental, the presumption being that Daniel had fallen and hit his head, then fallen overboard and drowned. But Daniel's family and friends were deeply skeptical. Daniel had grown up on these lakes, had been handling boats since he was a child. He was cautious, always wore a life jacket, was experienced with water safety. The idea that he'd simply fallen and drowned seemed unlikely. And the timing, right when he was in the middle of exposing Nordic Processing's illegal dumping, seemed more than coincidental. Sarah insisted that the police investigate this as something other than an accident. She told them about the threats Daniel had been receiving, about the pressure from Nordic Processing, about how worried he'd been in the weeks before his death. The police said they'd looked into it, but there was no evidence of foul play. The boat hadn't been tampered with. There were no signs of a struggle. Sometimes accidents happened, even to experienced people. Daniel's research advisor, Professor Helen Kimura, was also suspicious. She'd known Daniel well, had supervised his work for 2 years. He was methodical and careful, not someone who took unnecessary risks. Helen started going through Daniel's files, his research data, his documentation of the Nordic Processing case. She found that Daniel had been thorough, had backed up everything, had shared copies of his findings with multiple people in case something happened to him. He'd been worried enough to protect his work. Among Daniel's files, Helen found a hard drive labeled Backup that contained not just his research data, but also additional documentation he'd compiled on Nordic Processing. Financial records he'd obtained through public records requests. Internal company emails he'd received from a whistleblower. Photographs of the dump site taken on multiple occasions showing ongoing illegal disposal. This was more than just his thesis research. This was a comprehensive case file, evidence sufficient to bring criminal charges if the right people took it seriously. Helen contacted an investigative journalist, Marcus Perry, who worked for a major newspaper and specialized in corporate environmental crimes. She provided him with Daniel's files, explained the circumstances of Daniel's death, shared her suspicions that this had been more than an accident. Marcus spent months reviewing the material, conducting additional research, interviewing sources. What he found was damning. Nordic Processing had been conducting illegal dumping for years, saving millions of dollars in proper waste disposal costs. They'd made political contributions to state officials, hired well-connected law firms, created a network of protection that had shielded them from consequences. When Daniel had threatened to expose them, that protection had been jeopardized. Marcus couldn't prove that Nordic Processing had directly caused Daniel's death, but he could prove they had motive, means, and opportunity. The article Marcus published was detailed and devastating. It laid out the entire case, from Daniel's initial discovery of the contamination to his death under suspicious circumstances. It named specific executives at Nordic Processing and the larger parent company. It documented the political connections, the campaign contributions, the cozy relationships with state regulators. It called for criminal investigation not just of the environmental crimes, but of Daniel's death. The article created a firestorm. Federal agencies got involved. The FBI opened an investigation into both the illegal dumping and whether there had been any attempt to silence Daniel Reed. Nordic Processing's executives denied everything, hired expensive lawyers, fought to suppress the investigation. But the evidence Daniel had compiled was thorough and public pressure was intense. Criminal charges were eventually filed against 3 executives at Nordic Processing for environmental crimes. The company itself faced massive fines and was required to fund a comprehensive cleanup. The investigation into Daniel's death was more complicated. The FBI looked into whether anyone associated with Nordic Processing had been near the lake the day Daniel died, whether there was any evidence of a boat approaching Daniel's, whether his boat had been tampered with. They found some suggestive evidence, witness reports of an unidentified boat in the area, but nothing conclusive. The case remains technically unsolved as far as Daniel's death goes, though many people involved believe it was murder made to look like an accident. Daniel's family filed a civil lawsuit against Nordic Processing, alleging that the company's illegal activities and subsequent threats had created the circumstances that led to Daniel's death. The case settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. The settlement included no admission of wrongdoing from Nordic Processing, but it came with agreement to fund an environmental scholarship in Daniel's name and to implement comprehensive compliance monitoring at all their facilities nationwide. For Sarah, Daniel's girlfriend, the settlement didn't bring closure. She'd lost the person she'd planned to build a life with. She'd watched him become increasingly worried and stressed in the months before his death. She'd told him to drop the Nordic Processing investigation, to focus on his thesis and let others handle the enforcement. He'd said he couldn't, that if he'd found this evidence and didn't do anything with it, he'd be complicit in the harm. His conscience wouldn't let him walk away. That conscience might have cost him his life. Professor Kimura completed Daniel's thesis, work using the data he'd collected. She published it under both their names, making sure Daniel received credit for the research that had been so important to him. The work demonstrated significant contamination in multiple waterways traced back to Nordic Processing's illegal dumping. It became part of the evidence used in the criminal case. Daniel's research had accomplished what he'd hoped, contributed to holding polluters accountable and protecting natural resources, but he hadn't lived to see it. The case of Daniel Reed raises uncomfortable questions about what happens when individual citizens uncover corporate wrongdoing. Whistleblowers and researchers who expose illegal or harmful activities often face retaliation, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. They can lose their jobs, be blacklisted in their industries, face lawsuits designed to bankrupt them, or receive threats meant to silence them. The system that's supposed to protect people who report wrongdoing often fails to do so adequately. Daniel wasn't even a traditional whistleblower. He was a graduate student who happened to discover illegal activity while conducting legitimate research. He did everything right, reported it to appropriate agencies, provided thorough documentation, followed proper channels. And still, he faced threats and possibly worse. The message this sends is chilling. Uncovering inconvenient truths can be dangerous. Powerful entities with resources and connections can make problems go away, including the people who create those problems by insisting on accountability. There's a broader pattern here that extends beyond environmental crimes. Journalists who investigate corruption, activists who document human rights abuses, researchers who publish findings that threaten profitable industries. All of them face risks that shouldn't exist in a functioning democracy. Truth-seeking should be protected, celebrated, supported. Instead, it's often punished. The people who do this work know the risks and do it anyway because they believe it matters, because someone has to, because staying silent is its own kind of harm. Daniel's work did ultimately make a difference. Nordic Processing was held accountable, at least partially. The cleanup of the contamination sites prevented further environmental damage. The criminal charges sent a message to other companies about the consequences of illegal dumping. State environmental regulations were strengthened. A scholarship in Daniel's name supports other young environmental researchers. His impact outlived him, which is meaningful but also tragic. He shouldn't have had to die to make that impact. The question of whether Daniel's death was truly an accident or something more sinister will probably never be definitively answered. The FBI investigation is closed, filed under insufficient evidence. The people who might know the truth aren't talking. But circumstance and timing suggest something more than accident. Daniel was threats, was under pressure, was investigating powerful people, and then he died in a way that could plausibly be explained away as accident, but raised numerous red flags for anyone who knew him. This is the reality of many cases involving people who become inconvenient to powerful interests. The truth gets murky. Evidence is limited or contaminated. Investigations face obstacles. Even when criminal charges are brought, they often focus on the underlying crime being exposed rather than what might have happened to the person who exposed it. Justice is partial, incomplete, skewed toward protecting those with resources to protect themselves. 5 years after Daniel Reed's death, environmental groups in Vermont hold an annual memorial event on Lake Alder. They gather to remember Daniel, to recommit to protecting natural resources, to honor others who take risks to expose wrongdoing. His name has become symbolic of the cost of environmental advocacy, a reminder that this work isn't abstract or theoretical, but can have real consequences for real people. Sarah eventually left Vermont. Too many memories in a place that had become painful. She went back to school, got a degree in environmental law, decided that if Daniel had been willing to risk everything to expose illegal dumping, the least she could do was build a career around preventing that kind of harm. She works now for a nonprofit that provides legal support to environmental whistleblowers and researchers facing retaliation. She thinks about Daniel every day, wonders what their life together would have looked like, carries both grief and determination forward. Professor Kimura retired from teaching but continues to mentor graduate students doing environmental research. She's become an advocate for better protections for researchers who uncover wrongdoing, for clearer protocols about how universities should support students facing threats related to their work. She speaks at conferences, writes articles, keeps Daniel's story alive in academic circles. She believes that his death should mean something beyond tragedy, should lead to changes that protect others. The Reed case illustrates that justice is not always about individual perpetrators facing consequences for specific crimes. Sometimes justice is systemic change, is policies that prevent future harm, is cultural shifts in how we value truth-seeking and protect those who seek it. Daniel didn't get to see Nordic Processing executives arrested. He didn't get to complete his degree or build the career he'd planned. But his work survived him, contributed to accountability and change, and that matters even if it doesn't feel like enough. There's a cost to caring, to investigating, to refusing to look away from inconvenient truths. Daniel paid that cost. So have countless others, journalists killed for their reporting, activists imprisoned for their organizing, researchers harassed for their findings. We benefit from their courage and their sacrifice, even when we don't know their names, even when their stories don't make headlines. The world is better because people like Daniel existed, because they chose integrity over safety, even when the price was high. Now we come to the end of these stories, 5 lives that ended too soon, 5 investigations with different outcomes, 5 families forever changed by violence and loss. What connects them isn't just tragedy. It's the question of how we pursue truth and justice in a world where both are complicated, imperfect, often delayed or denied. It's the reality that time passes but questions endure, that evidence waits but justice doesn't always come, that knowing what happened doesn't undo the harm. Elena Ruiz's case was solved after 28 years through forensic genealogy, a technology that didn't exist when she was killed. Her family got answers and the satisfaction of seeing her killer convicted, But they also got those answers after decades of wondering, after her mother's death, after their lives had been shaped by unresolved grief. The resolution mattered, but it couldn't restore what had been lost. Lila Marino's family learned who killed her, but the person responsible was already dead. There was no trial, no confrontation, no moment of accountability. Just confirmation that came too late for any conventional form of justice. The truth existed, but it existed in a vacuum, answering questions but providing no target for the anger and grief that had accumulated over 40 years. Isaiah Coleman's case remains unsolved. His family still waits, still hopes, still lives with the daily uncertainty of not knowing who killed him or why. Despite dozens of witnesses and multiple cameras, despite the abundance of modern documentation, the truth remains elusive. They exist in a kind of limbo, unable to move forward, but unable to give up hope that someday there will be answers. Naomi Keller survived and saw her stalker convicted, a comparatively positive outcome. But survival came with trauma, with the violation of having been watched and controlled, with months of fear and years of recovery. Justice was served in her case. The system eventually worked, but she paid a high price for that outcome in stress and anxiety and diminished sense of safety. Daniel Reed's death might have been accident or might have been murder, the truth obscured by circumstance and the power dynamics of corporate interest versus individual researcher. His work survived him and contributed to accountability, but he didn't get to see it. His death remains officially unexplained, his family and friends left with suspicions they can't prove and questions that will probably never be fully answered. These stories demonstrate the messy reality of crime and justice. It's not clean. It's not satisfying. It's not the way it happens on television, where clever detectives solve everything in an hour and families get closure that feels complete. Real investigations take years or decades. Real families live with uncertainty and partial answers and justice that feels inadequate to the loss. Real resolution, when it comes, is complicated. But there's also something important in these stories about persistence. About detectives who pull cold case files and try again with new tools. About families who never stop calling, never stop pushing, never stop insisting that their loved one mattered and deserves answers. About evidence technicians who carefully preserve materials not knowing if they'll ever be useful. About journalists who investigate when official channels fail. About people who believe that truth matters even when pursuing it comes with risk. Time doesn't solve crimes. We need to be clear about that. Time is just duration, years passing, the world moving on. What solves crimes is people deciding not to move on, not to forget, not to accept that some questions will remain forever unanswered. It's detectives reopening cases. It's scientists developing new forensic tools. It's families refusing to let their loved one become just a statistic. It's communities keeping memories alive. It's all of us deciding that every victim matters, that every case deserves effort, that justice delayed is still worth pursuing. There's something deeply human about the need for answers. We want to understand why things happen, to identify causes, to assign responsibility. When someone we love is killed and we don't know who did it or why, we're left with a wound that can't begin to heal because we don't even fully understand what we're healing from. The wondering becomes its own form of torture, imagination filling in gaps with scenarios that might be worse than reality. This is why cold cases matter so much to the families who live with them. It's not just about punishment, though that matters too. It's about knowing. It's about being able to stop wondering, to have facts instead of endless speculation. Even when the truth is terrible, even when knowing brings fresh pain, there's something better about certainty than endless uncertainty. The human mind needs closure, needs to be able to categorize and file away and move forward. Without answers, we're stuck in a permanent present tense of not knowing. The families in these stories all had to learn to live with circumstances they never should have faced. They had to figure out how to continue existing while carrying enormous grief. They had to make decisions about whether to keep pushing for answers or to try to accept that answers might never come. They had to balance hope against resignation, determination against exhaustion. And they had to do all of this while also maintaining their regular lives, going to work, paying bills, fulfilling obligations, pretending to be okay when they fundamentally weren't. Patricia Coleman, Isaiah's mother, still looks at her phone every time it rings, hoping it might be a detective with news. It's been over a year and there's been no significant progress. but she can't stop hoping. She's made herself a promise that she won't die without knowing who killed her son. She's only 56, healthy, probably has decades left. But she thinks about time differently now, aware that every year that passes is another year without answers. Another year that evidence might degrade, or witnesses might forget, or the case might slip further toward permanent cold status. Carmen Ruiz, Elena's sister, says that the resolution of her sister's case felt both essential and somehow beside the point. Essential because they needed to know, because her mother needed to know before she died. Beside the point because knowing who killed Elena didn't bring Elena back, didn't erase the 28 years they'd spent wondering. Carmen says people assume that solving a cold case feels like relief, like a burden lifted. For her, it felt more like exhaustion, like she'd been holding her breath for decades and could finally exhale. But the exhalation left her empty and depleted. Victor Moreno died knowing who killed his daughter, but unable to confront that person, unable to see any accountability. His sons debate whether that knowledge was better than not knowing. Miguel thinks it was, that their father deserved truth even if he couldn't get justice. Carlos isn't sure, thinks maybe his father would have been better off dying without having a face to attach to his grief, without knowing that the person who killed Lila had lived free for decades before dying of natural causes. Antonio doesn't think there was a better option, thinks all the possibilities were bad, and they just got one version of bad rather than another. Naomi Keller has written about her experience, about being stalked and harassed, and about the trial. She's been criticized by people who think she shares too much, who think survivors should be more private about their trauma. She disagrees. She thinks silence protects perpetrators, that shame and privacy are what allow harassment and stalking to continue unchecked. She talks about what happened to her specifically so that other people will recognize warning signs in their own lives, will know they're not overreacting, will understand they deserve to be believed and protected. Sarah, Daniel Reed's girlfriend, says the hardest part is not knowing for sure what happened. If she could know definitively that his death was an accident, maybe she could accept it, could stop imagining alternate scenarios. If she could know definitively that he was killed, maybe she could direct her grief toward appropriate targets, could have the clarity of knowing who to blame. But the ambiguity, the strong suspicion without proof, that's uniquely difficult. She exists in a space between accident and murder, unable to commit fully to either interpretation. The communities where these crimes occurred have been affected too. Arroyo Bend, Nevada, still talks about Elena Ruiz, though most of the people who knew her have moved away or died. The case becoming solved after so long was news, reminded everyone of a tragedy some had forgotten or never known. The town is smaller now, more isolated, the kind of place young people leave for opportunities elsewhere. But Elena's story is part of the town's history, a reminder that even in quiet places, terrible things can happen. High Ridge Pass in New Mexico has seen changes in the decades since Lila Moreno was killed. Hitchhiking is rare now, considered too dangerous. The culture around women's safety has shifted, though not always in helpful ways. Women are told to protect themselves rather than society addressing why they need protection. Lila's brothers think about this, how the burden of prevention falls on potential victims rather than on addressing the root causes of violence. They wish the lesson of their sister's death had been different, had led to changing men's behavior rather than just restricting women's freedom. South Point Junction, Arizona, has grown rapidly in the years since Isaiah Coleman was killed. The intersection where he died has been rebuilt, traffic patterns changed, new businesses opened. People drive through it every day with no idea what happened there. Tasha sometimes drives past, looks at the spot where Zay's car had been, tries to reconcile the ordinary present with the terrible past. The location doesn't hold any visible mark of what occurred. Life continues, indifferent to history. Rainhaven, Oregon, became briefly famous as the place where a cyberstalking case was prosecuted using digital surveillance evidence. The university where Naomi worked implemented new policies about staff safety in response to harassment complaints. The nonprofit she worked for when Evan was there did a comprehensive review of their hiring and background check processes. These were positive changes, but they came after harm had been done, reactive rather than preventive. Naomi points out that reactive changes are still valuable, but wishes institutions would be more proactive about safety. Lake Alder Basin, Vermont, remains beautiful and rural. Tourists still come in summer, drawn by the scenery and outdoor recreation. Most of them don't know about Daniel Reed, about illegal dumping or suspicious deaths or corporate environmental crimes. They see postcard Vermont, wilderness and water and peace. The locals know better. They remember what happened. Some of them are more skeptical now of corporate assurances, more likely to question when companies claim to be environmentally responsible. Daniel's death politicized people who hadn't been political before. These 5 stories, these 5 lives, these 5 families, represent a tiny fraction of unsolved or delayed justice cases across the country. For every case that eventually gets solved, many remain permanently cold. For every family that gets answers, even inadequate ones, many never do. The resources for investigating old cases are limited. Forensic technology, while improving, is expensive and not universally available. Political will to fund cold case units waxes and wanes. Media attention is fickle, focusing on some cases while ignoring others. There are patterns in which cases get attention and which don't. Missing white women generate more media coverage than missing women of color. Victims from affluent families get more investigation resources than victims from poor families. Cases in urban areas with well-funded police departments get more forensic analysis than cases in rural areas with limited resources. These disparities are well documented and deeply troubling, reflecting broader societal inequalities. Justice shouldn't depend on race or class or geography, but it often does. The families of victims know these disparities intimately. They see other cases getting media coverage while theirs is ignored. They watch resources flow to some investigations while their loved one's case languishes. They understand that their ability to get answers might depend on factors that have nothing to do with the merit of their case or the severity of the crime. This knowledge adds another layer of pain, the awareness that the injustice of the crime itself is compounded by injustice in how it's investigated. If there's any hope in these stories, it's in the persistence of people who refuse to accept that some cases are unsolvable. The detectives who volunteer their time to work cold cases after retirement. The forensic scientists who develop new techniques for analyzing old evidence. The journalists who investigate when official channels fail. The family members who become amateur investigators themselves, learning forensic science and legal procedures, keeping cases alive through sheer determination. The strangers on the internet who research cold cases as a hobby, sometimes identifying crucial details that official investigations missed. This network of unofficial investigators and advocates has contributed to solving numerous cold cases. Online sleuths have identified Jane and John Doe's, providing names to previously unidentified victims. True crime podcasts have generated tips that broke open stalled investigations. Social media campaigns have kept pressure on law enforcement to continue working cases that had gone dormant. This distributed, grassroots approach to seeking justice isn't a substitute for proper official investigation, but it's become an important supplement, filling gaps that official resources can't or won't fill. There are concerns about this trend too, of course. Amateur investigators sometimes spread misinformation. Internet sleuths occasionally harass innocent people based on speculation. The line between raising awareness and exploiting tragedy for entertainment can be blurry. Families of victims have complicated feelings about their loved one's case becoming subject to online speculation and discussion. Some appreciate the attention and help. Others find it invasive and painful. There's no simple answer about whether the benefits outweigh the costs. What's clear is that crime and justice have become increasingly public, increasingly participatory. People feel invested in cases they have no direct connection to. They want to help, want to contribute, want to be part of solving mysteries. This impulse comes from a good place, a belief that everyone deserves justice, that every victim matters. But it needs to be channeled responsibly, with respect for families and awareness of the harm that can come from well-meaning but misguided efforts. The 5 cases detailed here show different facets of this complex landscape. Elena's case was solved through official channels, but only because technology advanced and a detective decided to pull the file. Lila's case was similarly solved officially, but with an outcome that couldn't bring full justice. Zay's case remains unsolved despite abundant evidence, demonstrating that information alone doesn't guarantee resolution. Naomi's case was solved because she documented everything and police eventually took her seriously, but also because she survived to push for accountability. Daniel's case might have been solved, or might have been an accident, and the ambiguity may never be resolved. Each case offers lessons about preservation of evidence, about the importance of believing people who report threats or harassment, about the limitations of surveillance and witnesses, about the power dynamics that can obstruct justice, about the role of new technology in revisiting old questions, about the cost of seeking truth when powerful interests prefer secrecy, about time's impact on investigation and memory and possibility. But beyond the lessons, these are stories about specific people who lived and died and deserved better. Elena Ruiz, who worked at a diner and wanted a quiet life and was killed for no reason that made sense. Lila Moreno, who was 19 and hitchhiking home and encountered evil in a form she couldn't anticipate. Isaiah Coleman, who was 23 and driving through an intersection and was killed in circumstances no one can fully explain. Naomi Keller, who survived being stalked but carries the trauma of that violation. Daniel Reed, who cared about protecting the environment and might have died for that care. These weren't just victims. They were people with families and friends and plans for their futures. They had favorite foods and songs they listened to and places they liked to go. They laughed and worried and hoped. They were complex individuals reduced, by violence or death, to case files and news stories. Remembering them as people, not just as tragedies, is part of honoring them. They existed before they became victims. That existence mattered. The families who survive victims carry the weight of keeping their memory alive. It's exhausting work, being the keeper of someone else's story, making sure they're not forgotten. But it's also necessary work, because if families don't do it, who will? Society moves on. New tragedies demand attention. Old cases fade from public consciousness. Without someone insisting that a victim's life and death still matter, it's easy for them to be lost entirely. This is why annual memorials happen, why scholarships are created in victims' names, why family members do media interviews years or decades after a death. Not because they enjoy reliving trauma or want attention, but because they need the world to remember. They need their loved one's death to mean something beyond just one more statistic. They need to feel that the victim's life had value and impact, that they left a mark on the world even if it came through tragedy. Some people criticize families for not being able to move on, for dwelling on the past, for not accepting what happened and finding peace. These criticisms reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of grief, particularly grief from unresolved violent death. You don't move on from something like that. You move forward with it. It becomes part of who you are, woven into the fabric of your identity. You learn to live with it, to function despite it, but you don't leave it behind. It travels with you. The shape of grief changes over time. Early grief is acute, overwhelming, makes it hard to think about anything else. Later grief becomes more chronic, always present but less constantly debilitating. But there are triggers that bring back the acute phase, even years later. A solved case, an anniversary, a news story about a similar crime, a song that the victim loved. Grief doesn't progress linearly toward resolution. It ebbs and flows, cycles through intensity and numbness, anger and sadness, hope and despair. For families of victims in unsolved cases, there's an additional layer of what's called ambiguous grief. This is grief without clear resolution, without the ability to mark an ending and begin processing. The case isn't closed, so in some sense the victim's story isn't finished. The family can't fully focus on memory and meaning when they're still seeking answers about what happened. This kind of grief is particularly difficult to navigate because there's no established path through it, no clear stages or expected progression. When cases are solved, even decades later, families often describe feeling like they can finally start grieving properly. The wondering consumed so much energy that there wasn't much left for the emotional processing of loss. With answers, that energy can be redirected toward healing. But as Carmen Ruiz noted, the relief of knowing is complicated, mixed with exhaustion and anger about how long it took. The delayed justice doesn't undo the decades of not knowing. It just finally allows the family to move into a different phase of grief. The question of what justice means is central to all of these stories. Is justice punishment? Accountability? Knowledge? Prevention? Restitution? Change? Different people define it differently, and there's no single correct answer. For some families, justice requires seeing perpetrators imprisoned. For others, It's enough to know what happened and who was responsible, even if that person is beyond punishment. For still others, justice means systemic changes that prevent similar crimes. Most families want multiple forms of justice, a combination of individual accountability and broader change. But even when justice is served in conventional terms, it's incomplete. No sentence can balance the scales when someone has been killed. No amount of prison time gives back the decades that were stolen. No guilty verdict undoes the harm or heals the trauma. Justice in these cases is necessarily partial, symbolic, a gesture toward accountability that can never fully achieve it. We pursue it anyway because it matters, because the alternative is accepting that crimes have no consequences, but we should be honest about its limitations. The criminal justice system itself is imperfect, sometimes deeply flawed. Investigations fail. Innocent people are sometimes convicted. Guilty people sometimes go free. Resources are unevenly distributed. Bias affects who gets investigated and how. The system reflects broader societal inequalities and problems. Families seeking justice must navigate this imperfect system, often while dealing with their own trauma and grief, often without resources or support. It's an additional burden on people who've already suffered enormously. Reform efforts are ongoing, attempts to make the system more fair and effective. Better training for investigators. More resources for evidence analysis. Reforms to reduce bias in prosecution and sentencing. Improved support for crime victims and their families. These efforts matter and make real differences when implemented thoughtfully. But reform is slow and often incomplete, facing resistance from entrenched interests and limited funding. The families who need the system to work better can't wait for reforms. They have to navigate the system as it exists now. If there's a takeaway from these 5 stories, it might be this: justice is messy, incomplete, often delayed, sometimes denied, but still worth pursuing. Truth matters even when it comes too late. Accountability matters even when it can't undo harm. Memory matters even when the world wants to forget. And the people who persist in seeking justice, who refuse to accept that some questions will remain forever unanswered, who keep pushing despite exhaustion and frustration and grief, they matter enormously. They're the ones who solve cold cases. They're the ones who force change. They're the ones who ensure that victims are remembered as people who mattered. These stories don't have neat endings because reality doesn't provide neat endings. Elena Ruiz's case was solved, but her family spent nearly 3 decades without answers. Lila Moreno's family knows who killed her, but that person is beyond accountability. Isaiah Coleman's case remains unsolved, his family still waiting. Naomi Keller got justice, but carries trauma. Daniel Reed's death remains ambiguous, answered and unanswered simultaneously. Each outcome is different, each incomplete in its own way, each representing one possibility among many in the complicated landscape of crime and justice. The families continue living their lives, carrying their losses and their knowledge forward. Some have found ways to channel their grief into advocacy or education or support for others going through similar experiences. Some have struggled with the ongoing weight of what happened. Some have found peace, or something like it, through time and processing and support. Some haven't and maybe never will. There's no right way to survive this kind of loss, no timeline for healing, no formula for making sense of senselessness. What connects all these families is the experience of having their lives permanently altered by violence. They exist in a before and after, their personal histories divided by the moment everything changed. They remember who they were before, and they're different people now, shaped by loss and grief and the long process of seeking answers and justice. They didn't choose this transformation. It was forced on them by someone else's actions, but they've had to find ways to live with it, to build lives that accommodate this fundamental shift. Time does not erase truth. That's the title of this collection, and it's the thread running through all 5 stories. Evidence waits decades to speak. Families never stop seeking answers. Technology advances and allows new questions to be asked of old data. People who know things eventually talk, whether years or decades later. Truth has a stubborn quality, a resistance to complete burial. It may be delayed, obscured, complicated, but it tends to persist. This persistence of truth is both hopeful and painful. Hopeful because it means that even old cases can potentially be solved, that families might get answers they'd given up expecting. Painful because it means that the wounds don't fully heal, that the past doesn't stay in the past, that resolution, when it comes, brings fresh grief along with whatever closure it provides. The truth that emerges after decades exists in a strange temporal space, simultaneously past and present, simultaneously old news and breaking revelation. The role of time in these stories is complex. Time is what buries evidence and fades memories and kills witnesses. But time is also what allows technology to advance, what gives investigators new tools, what sometimes wears down people who know things until they're willing to talk. Time is both obstacle and ally in the pursuit of justice. It works against investigations and for them simultaneously. Understanding this dual nature of time is crucial to understanding cold cases and delayed justice. For the people living through these situations, time can feel warped. Days crawl by while years fly past. The period immediately after a death or crime feels endless, every hour heavy with shock and grief. Then suddenly years have passed, and you're not sure where they went, how you survived them, what you did with all that time besides wait. Families talk about this temporal distortion, how grief and uncertainty affect their perception of time's passage. There's also the strange experience of time stopping for the victim while continuing for everyone else. The victim remains frozen at the age they were when they died, never growing older, never changing. But their family members age, their friends move through life stages, the world changes around the memory of who the victim was. This creates a kind of temporal displacement, where the victim exists permanently in the past while being mourned in the present. It's disorienting, a constant reminder of everything that was taken. The victims in these stories were all robbed of their futures. Elena was 26, had a whole life ahead of her. Lila was 19, just beginning adulthood. Isaiah was 23, building a career and relationship. Naomi survived, but had to rebuild her sense of safety and privacy. Daniel was 27, working on research he cared about. These were people with potential, with plans, with people who loved them and futures that should have unfolded but didn't. That loss of potential, of the life that should have been, is part of what families grieve. When families talk about their losses, they often describe not just grief for who the person was, but grief for who they would have become. The milestones that won't happen, the experiences that won't be shared, the person they would have grown into over decades. This future-oriented grief is particularly acute with younger victims, people who had most of their lives still ahead of them. It's mourning something that never existed but should have, an absence of presence that extends forward in time. The impact of these crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims and families. Communities are affected, shaped by the knowledge that someone who lived among them committed terrible acts, or that someone they knew was victimized. Friends of victims carry their own grief and sometimes guilt, wondering if they could have prevented what happened or done something differently. Coworkers, neighbors, acquaintances, all find themselves caught in the ripple effects of violence that wasn't directed at them but still touched their lives. There's also the impact on the investigators, particularly those who work cold cases. Reading files about decades-old murders, looking at crime scene photos of people long dead, speaking with families who've waited so long for answers, it takes a toll. Some investigators become deeply invested in specific cases, thinking about them outside work hours, feeling personal responsibility to solve them. The emotional weight of that work is significant, and not all police departments provide adequate support for people doing it. The journalists who cover these stories also experience impact. Researching violent crimes, interviewing grieving families, writing about trauma and loss, it affects you even when you're trying to maintain professional distance. Good crime journalism requires empathy, the ability to understand and convey the human dimension of tragedy. But empathy means feeling some portion of the pain you're documenting. Journalists working this beat often develop strategies for protecting their mental health, but the work still leaves marks. Even readers and viewers of true crime content experience impact, though of a different kind and scale. Consuming stories about violence and death can affect how you see the world, make you more fearful or vigilant, shape your understanding of safety and risk. This isn't necessarily negative. Some increase in awareness of danger is realistic and useful, but it can also become disproportionate, leading to anxiety that doesn't match actual risk levels. Finding a balance between awareness and anxiety is an ongoing challenge for people who engage with true crime content. The question of why people are drawn to true crime is itself complex. Some of the interest is probably voyeuristic, the same impulse that makes people slow down to look at car accidents. But much of it is more thoughtful than that. People want to understand how and why terrible things happen. They want to believe that crimes can be solved, that justice is possible, that there's order and meaning even in chaos. They want to learn how to protect themselves and people they care about. They're drawn to stories of survival and resilience and justice delayed, but eventually served. True crime content also serves an educational function, teaching people about the realities of the criminal justice system, about how investigations work, about the signs of dangerous situations or relationships. Naomi Keller's story, for instance, teaches about stalking and digital harassment, about recognizing escalating behavior and documenting it. Daniel Reed's story illustrates what can happen to whistleblowers and the importance of protecting people who expose wrongdoing. Each case offers lessons that viewers and readers can potentially apply to their own lives or use to advocate for change. But there's also responsibility in how these stories are told. Sensationalizing violence, focusing on gruesome details rather than human impact, treating victims as characters rather than people, all of these approaches are harmful. Good true crime storytelling respects the victims and families, focuses on substance over sensation, acknowledges complexity rather than oversimplifying. It's possible to tell these stories in ways that inform and honor rather than exploit. That's what this collection has attempted to do. The 5 cases detailed here represent different aspects of crime and justice, different outcomes and timelines and circumstances. But they're all rooted in the same fundamental tragedy. Someone's life was cut short by violence, and the aftermath of that violence extended forward in time, affecting families and communities and systems. The specific details differ, but the core experience of loss and the pursuit of understanding and accountability is shared across all of them. As we reach the end of these stories, it's important to acknowledge what hasn't been resolved. Isaiah Coleman's case remains open, his family still waiting for answers that may never come. The question of whether Daniel Reed was killed or died accidentally will probably never be definitively answered. Even the cases that were officially solved left families with complicated feelings about outcomes that couldn't restore what was taken. These loose ends aren't failures of storytelling. They're reflections of reality. Not everything resolves neatly. Not every question gets answered. Sometimes we have to live with uncertainty and incomplete information. This is hard for people to accept, especially in a culture that values closure and resolution. We want our stories to have endings, our questions to have answers, our problems to have solutions. But some situations resist that kind of tidy conclusion. Some losses can't be made sense of. Some crimes can't be fully understood. Some justice can't be achieved. Learning to live with that reality, to hold space for irresolution and ambiguity, is part of the work of surviving tragedy. The families featured in these stories have had to develop that capacity, that ability to exist with unanswered questions or inadequate answers. They've had to figure out how to move forward when the path isn't clear, when there's no guidebook for navigating their specific circumstances. They've had to find meaning in situations that feel fundamentally meaningless, had to build lives around losses that shouldn't have happened. It's extraordinary work, the kind that doesn't get enough recognition or support. If there's any message to take from these 5 stories, it might be this. Pay attention to the people around you who are living with loss and uncertainty. Believe them when they say something is wrong. Take their concerns seriously even when there isn't yet proof of danger. Support investigations even years after crimes occurred. Advocate for resources to analyze evidence and pursue cold cases. Push for systemic changes that might prevent future tragedies. Remember that victims were people, not just statistics, and that their families deserve both answers and compassion. We can also take away lessons about evidence and investigation. Preserve everything, even when it seems like a case will never be solved. Document thoroughly, because you don't know what future technology might be able to do with current data. Follow up on tips and leads even when they seem unlikely. Listen to people who know the victim, who might have insights that aren't immediately obvious. Use every tool available, but also acknowledge that tools have limitations and can't solve everything. There are lessons about belief and credibility. When someone says they're being threatened or stalked or harassed, believe them. When patterns of behavior raise concerns, take them seriously. Don't wait for violence to occur before responding to warning signs. Create systems and policies that protect people who report wrongdoing or danger. Recognize that power imbalances affect who gets believed and who gets dismissed, and work actively to counter that bias. There are lessons about time and patience and persistence. Justice is often slow. Investigations take longer than we want them to. Answers come later than families need them. But giving up means accepting that some crimes will never have consequences, that some victims will be forgotten, that some families will never get the closure they deserve. Persistence, even in the face of long odds, matters. Every cold case that eventually gets solved demonstrates why we can't give up. There are lessons about technology and its double-edged nature. Forensic genealogy solves decades-old cases but raises privacy concerns. Digital surveillance enables stalking but also creates evidence trails. Social media connects people but can also expose them to danger. We need to develop technology thoughtfully, with consideration for both its benefits and its risks, with protections for the vulnerable built into systems rather than added as afterthoughts. There are lessons about systemic change and prevention. Individual cases are important. Individual justice matters. But we also need to look at patterns and address root causes. Why is violence against women so common? Why do some communities have more unsolved cases than others? How do we prevent corporate wrongdoing and protect whistleblowers? What policies and practices would actually reduce harm? These questions are harder than solving individual cases, but they're essential for making meaningful change. The 5 victims whose stories have been told here deserve better than what happened to them. They deserve to live their lives without violence, without their futures being stolen. Their families deserve not to have to experience the pain of loss and the frustration of seeking justice. The communities they lived in deserved not to be marked by these tragedies. None of what happened to them should have happened. That's the fundamental injustice at the heart of all of these stories. But in the aftermath of what happened, some things were done right. Evidence was preserved carefully enough to be useful decades later. Investigators refused to give up on cold cases. Families maintained pressure for answers even when it would have been easier to resign themselves to not knowing. Survivors documented and reported despite fear and social pressure not to make trouble. Journalists investigated when official channels failed. Changes were made to prevent similar harms in the future. None of this undid what happened, but it mattered nonetheless. Elena Ruiz's killer was eventually caught and convicted. Her family got answers, even though those answers came too late for her mother to know them. The case demonstrated the value of forensic genealogy and careful evidence preservation. Lila Moreno's killer was identified even though he was beyond prosecution. Her family learned what happened, giving them a different kind of closure than they'd hoped for, but closure nonetheless. Isaiah Coleman's case remains unsolved, but his family continues to push for answers, keeping his memory alive and his case active. Naomi Keller survived and saw her stalker convicted, then used her experience to help others. Daniel Reed's work survived him and contributed to holding polluters accountable, giving his death meaning even in its tragedy. These outcomes are all imperfect. None of them feel like enough given what was lost. But they're also not nothing. They represent thousands of hours of work by investigators and journalists and family members. They represent the development and application of new technologies. They represent policy changes and legal precedents. They represent the stubborn insistence that truth matters and justice, however delayed and incomplete, is worth pursuing. As this collection comes to a close, take a moment to think about the victims as people, not just as cases or stories. Elena working at the diner, friendly and professional, saving money and living quietly. Lila at 19, making the ordinary decision to hitchhike home, trusting that she'd be safe. Isaiah running errands on a Saturday afternoon, planning the rest of his weekend, unaware it would be his last. Naomi doing important work helping survivors, not knowing she would become someone who needed help herself. Daniel in his boat on the lake, collecting water samples for research he believed in, engaged in the work that likely cost him his life. These were real people who lived and died and mattered. Their stories are difficult, sometimes disturbing, often frustrating, but they're important. They remind us that crimes have real victims, real families left behind, real consequences that ripple forward through time. They show us the complexity of justice and investigation, the imperfections of systems we depend on, the gaps that need to be filled. They demonstrate the importance of persistence and care and believing people when they say something is wrong. Before we end, I want to ask you to do something. If you've made it this far, if you've spent 3 hours listening to these stories, take a moment to engage. Hit that like button if this content mattered to you. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more stories told with this level of care and depth. But most importantly, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what resonated with you. Tell me if you have experience with the criminal justice system, or with loss, or with the long wait for answers. Your engagement helps this content reach more people, helps these stories have impact beyond just the telling. Time does not erase truth. That's what these 5 stories demonstrate, each in their own way. Evidence waits in boxes and databases and memory. Technology advances and allows new questions to be asked. Families persist in seeking answers. Investigators refuse to accept that some cases are unsolvable. Truth has a stubborn quality, a resistance to complete erasure. It may take years or decades to emerge, but it tends to persist. Justice is not fast, but it can be stubborn too. It's the accumulation of countless small actions by countless people who refuse to give up. It's the detective who pulls a cold case file. It's the family member who calls every month. It's the evidence technician who preserves samples carefully. It's the forensic scientist who develops new analysis methods. It's the journalist who investigates when official channels fail. It's the survivor who documents and reports and testifies. It's all of us deciding that every victim matters, that every case deserves effort, that even delayed justice is worth pursuing. These stories don't have neat endings because reality doesn't provide them. What they have instead is continuation, ongoing impact, meaning that extends forward from tragedy. Elena's case contributed to wider use of forensic genealogy. Lila's case reminded people that knowing matters even without prosecution. Isaiah's case remains a call for justice, unresolved but not forgotten. Naomi's case taught about digital harassment and the importance of documentation. Daniel's case exposed corporate environmental crimes and led to systemic changes. The victims didn't get to see these outcomes. They didn't get to know that their deaths would mean something beyond just loss. But their families carry forward that meaning, ensure that the victims are remembered, push for the changes that might prevent future tragedies. That work is exhausting and painful and never truly finished, but it matters enormously. It's how we honor the dead, by refusing to let them become just statistics, by insisting that they were people who deserved better than what happened to them. As we close these stories, sit with the discomfort of their incompleteness. Don't rush to find silver linings or lessons that make the tragedies feel more manageable. These were terrible things that happened to people who didn't deserve them. The pursuit of justice and truth is important, but it doesn't make what happened okay. It doesn't balance any scales or restore any losses. It's simply what we owe to the victims and their families, the bare minimum of acknowledgement and effort. Remember Elena. Remember Lila. Remember Isaiah. Remember what Naomi survived. Remember Daniel. Remember that they were people, complex and complete, who had lives and loved ones and futures that should have unfolded but didn't. Remember their families, still carrying their losses, still seeking answers, or living with the ones they received, still navigating a world that was permanently changed for them. Remember that crime and justice are not abstract concepts, but concrete realities affecting real people in real ways. And remember, that time does not erase truth. It may delay it, obscure it, complicate it, but truth persists. Justice may be slow and incomplete, but it's worth pursuing. Memory matters. Evidence matters. Persistence matters. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every case deserves effort. Every family deserves answers, however long it takes to provide them. That's the message at the heart of these 5 stories, the thread connecting them all. We don't give up. We keep seeking truth, keep pursuing justice, keep remembering the victims, because that's what they deserve. That's what we all deserve. Thank you for staying with these stories to the end. Thank you for caring about people you'll never meet, cases you have no direct connection to, families whose grief you can only imagine. That care matters. It's part of what keeps these stories alive, what maintains pressure for justice, what ensures victims are remembered. If you found value in this, share it with others. Engage in the comments. Support channels that tell these stories with respect and depth. And most importantly, remember, time does not erase truth, and people, not time, solve crimes. Sometimes long after the world stops watching.